Alex here, and today, we are going to look at three influencers who climbed without permits and never came home. Delusional self-belief and a hunger for viral glory made them mock experienced climbers and illegally chartered a helicopter to skip the trek. What followed was a cascade of stupid decisions so breathtaking it turned Everest into a selfie studio of horrors. It was April 12th, 2023. Mount Everest sits on the border between Nepal and Tibet. The peak stands at 29,032 feet above sea level. That's over 5.5 miles straight up into the sky. The air at the summit has roughly a third of the oxygen you'd be breathing right now. Your brain starts shutting down. Your fingers and toes start dying. Your body is making a very loud, very clear argument for you to go back down. And the only way to survive is to listen. Every year, the Nepalese government issues a limited number of climbing permits. As of recent seasons, one permit runs about $11,000 per person, just for the right to attempt the climb. On top of that, you need a certified guide, the right equipment, oxygen systems, fees for base camp, fees for the icefall route, and all of it is tracked. Your name goes on a list. You get a permit tag that physically attaches to your oxygen bottles and your tent. Other climbers can see it. Expedition leaders can check it. Officials monitor radio communications. The system isn't perfect, but it exists because people die on this mountain, and the permits are part of how Nepal keeps some control over who goes up and whether they have any chance of coming back down. Yael Banavri, Saskia Patel, and May Aransibia did not have permits. They knew they didn't have permits. They planned the entire thing around the illegality of it, and somehow, incredibly, they thought that was fine. The three of them ran a joint travel account, one of those polished, heavily filtered feeds where every photo looks like it was shot for a luxury resort advertisement. Destinations in golden hour light, matching luggage, captions about authentic experiences and living with intention. They had enough followers to land small sponsorships, outdoor gear brands, a protein supplement company, a travel insurance service that I sincerely hope is cringing right now. Yael was the loudest one, both on camera and apparently in person. She had a way of turning every inconvenience into content and every obstacle into proof that the world was conspiring against creative women. She was the kind of person who described a delayed flight as a spiritual test and a bad hotel room as a character-building experience, always with that specific influencer cadence that makes everything sound like it's being narrated for an audience of people who need permission to feel inspired. Saskia was the one who handled the logistics, or what passed for logistics in their operation. May was quieter in the videos, but no less committed to the project. She had recently started posting more solo content, positioning herself as the adventure purist of the group, whatever that meant. Somewhere in the months before their Everest attempt, the three of them had landed on an idea. They were going to do what no women's team had done before, a fully independent, permit-free, unsupported ascent of Everest. They called it a historic all-female rogue ascent. They said it out loud, on camera, multiple times. They used the word rogue like it was a brand strategy, not a criminal description. They talked about sticking it to the gatekeepers of the climbing world, by which they seemed to mean anyone who had put in years of training and technical work and, yes, paid the legal fees to be there. The permit fee, Yael announced to her camera at one point, was just legalized robbery. Saskia laughed and said they had each saved over $10,000 by cutting the government out. May nodded and said the mountain didn't belong to anyone. The mountain, for the record, very much has a governing body, and it keeps records. To avoid the standard approach through the Khumbu Valley, a multi-day trek that virtually every Everest climber does both for acclimatization and because it's the required route, the three of them chartered a private helicopter and flew directly to the vicinity of base camp. The Khumbu Valley trek is about 38 miles over roughly 8 to 12 days. It's not optional. It's not just a scenic walk to enjoy the views. It's how your body starts adjusting to the altitude before you go anywhere near the dangerous parts. The gradual increase in elevation is what gives your blood time to produce more red blood cells, what lets your lungs learn to work harder, what keeps your brain functional enough to make decisions that might save your life. The women, however, thought the hike was for tourists. Yael said this on camera. She said it with genuine disdain. So they paid a helicopter operator, under the table, through a contact Saskia had apparently found through a third party, to drop them near base camp. No registration, no acclimatization days, no formal arrival process. But bypassing the permit system is far more than skipping a helicopter ride. Everest's Khumbu route is not an open hiking trail. It is heavily monitored expedition infrastructure. To climb without detection, they would have needed access through checkpoints staffed by officials who cross-reference permit lists, coordination with Sherpa logistics for carrying gear and setting camps, access to the icefall route, which requires knowledge of fixed rope timings and ladder installations, and an illegal oxygen supply chain, since every bottle of supplemental oxygen on the mountain is tracked by expedition operators. Simply landing near base camp does not grant entry to the upper mountain. The controlled flow of people and equipment makes a truly rogue ascent nearly impossible without inside help or months of covert planning. They landed, stepped out onto the glacier, and started filming immediately. The first sign came almost immediately. One of them, May, based on the footage that was later recovered, bent over and vomited within minutes of landing. She straightened up, looked at the camera, and made a face. Her hands were tingling, she said. She held them up like she was surprised by them. Her fingers looked pale. That tingling is your peripheral nervous system reacting to hypoxia, oxygen deprivation. At base camp, you're already sitting at around 17,600 feet. May's body, which had been at sea level less than a day earlier, was already starting to protest. The vomiting was altitude sickness. The tingling was her blood vessels constricting and her body struggling to figure out where all the oxygen had gone. Their guide, Nazir, saw May vomiting and hesitated. He knew dehydration was dangerous at altitude, but he also knew they had no privacy and limited water. In his cargo hauling days, porters often rationed water at night to avoid leaving the tent in the cold. He told her to drink a little less. A mistake born of habit, not malice, but a mistake nonetheless. I want you to sit with that for a second. A woman showing signs of altitude sickness, and the advice from the man responsible for their lives was to drink less water. Now, let's talk about Nazir. Nazir was not a climbing guide. He had never been a climbing guide. He worked as a cargo loader for trekking companies, carrying supplies, moving gear between camps, doing the unglamorous physical work that keeps the expedition economy running. He was good at his job. By all accounts, he was a reliable worker who knew the lower approaches of the mountain reasonably well from years of carrying loads. He was not qualified to guide clients up Everest. He had never used supplemental oxygen systems with clients before. He had never led anyone through the Khumbu Icefall, which is the first and arguably most dangerous section of the standard route, a churning, shifting maze of ice towers called seracs, crevasses that drop hundreds of feet, and aluminum ladders lashed together across gaps that would kill you instantly if you fell. The icefall moves. It creaks and groans and collapses. There are windows of time each day when it's safer to cross, and windows of time when you do not cross if you have any sense. Experienced guides know these windows. They know the fixed rope procedures. They know how to read the ice. Nazir had crossed the icefall before, as a loader, never as a guide, and never responsible for keeping someone else alive while doing it. He took the job because he owed money, gambling debts according to people who knew him. The women were paying well, in cash, no paperwork. He needed it. The women knew all of this. This was not a case of someone being deceived about their guide's credentials. Yael, in footage that would eventually be recovered, waved off the concern explicitly. They didn't need some celebrity Sherpa babysitting them, she said. They were strong, capable women who had done their research. They had watched videos online. They had talked to people on forums. They were fine. At base camp, or rather, on the outskirts of base camp, since they couldn't register at the official camp without revealing that their names weren't on any permit list. The chaos started almost immediately. They had packed wrong. Not wrong in a minor way, not a forgotten luxury item, wrong in the way that gets people killed. They wandered into neighboring expedition camps asking to borrow stove fuel. They asked around for glove liners, the thin insulating layer you wear inside your main gloves. One of them needed crampon straps, the metal spikes that attach to your boots and are the difference between walking on ice and immediately dying on ice. These are not items you borrow. These are items you plan for. These are items that are on every single packing checklist for Everest, which are themselves freely available online in guidebooks, from any guide service, from any gear retailer that sells high-altitude equipment. You don't forget crampon straps the way you forget to pack an extra pair of socks. You forget crampon straps because you are not taking this seriously. The expedition teams nearby watched all of this quietly. You have to understand the culture of high-altitude climbing. It's polite, it's cautious, people help each other when they're in trouble, but there's also a shared understanding that you don't meddle in other teams' business unless someone is about to die. People took note. People talked quietly among themselves. More than one experienced climber later said they noticed immediately that the three women had no permit tags anywhere visible, and that the man with them seemed unsure about basic procedures. No one said anything, not yet. While filming a sponsorship reel for one of her gear brands, one of the brands I'd like to note, whose products she apparently didn't know how to use, Saskia clipped her harness on backward. The harness is your connection to the safety ropes. It's what keeps you on the mountain if you slip. Clipping it backward compromises that completely. Nazir didn't catch it. Another climber passing nearby stopped and pointed it out. Saskia laughed it off on camera. She said something about how she was still warming up. They were at base camp. They hadn't started climbing yet. The night before they entered the ice fall, Nazir sat down with them, or so a nearby climber described it later, and tried to explain the ladder crossing technique. The icefall has sections where you cross crevasses on horizontal aluminum ladders lashed end to end, sometimes stretching 20 or 30 feet across open air over drops that vanish into darkness. You cross clipped into a safety line, moving carefully, one foot in front of the other, crampons balanced on the ladder rungs. It requires concentration and nerve, and the understanding that the rope you're clipped to will, at minimum, prevent you from falling free. Nazir had crossed the icefall dozens of times as a loader. He knew the ladder technique, but explaining it to frightened clients while his own nerves frayed was different. He stumbled over the details, forgot to mention how to handle the transition points, and gave vague answers about spacing. His knowledge was there, but his ability to teach it under pressure was failing. Yael asked if the safety line, the fixed rope that runs the entire route, was something they actually needed to be clipped into, or if it was just there as a psychological comfort for people who weren't confident. She was, based on everything I've read, completely serious. Nazir told her she should clip in. She filmed herself not clipping in at the first ladder. She walked across it freehand, looking at the camera, smiling. 20 feet below her, the crevasse disappeared into shadow. Inside the icefall, things got worse in ways that felt almost engineered. The icefall is not a place you linger. The entire philosophy of crossing it is speed with care. You move through the most dangerous sections efficiently because the longer you're in there, the more exposure you have to seracs collapsing, to ice shifting, to the general structural chaos of 2 billion tons of glacier doing what glaciers do. Experienced teams cross in the early morning hours before the day's warming destabilizes the ice. They move with purpose. They do not stop in exposed sections unless they have to. The women stopped constantly, not for safety checks, not to manage equipment, but to film. TikTok clips, short videos of themselves in the middle of the icefall with their helmets slightly askew and their pack straps not properly cinched. At one point, 2 of them removed their gloves entirely to retouch their makeup. The temperature was well below freezing, probably around -10 to -15 degrees Fahrenheit in the icefall section, and that's before accounting for wind. Frostbite on exposed fingers in those conditions can start in under 10 minutes. They touched up their foundation and put their gloves back on and kept filming. Then May dropped her phone. She was crossing a ladder, filming herself crossing a ladder, when the phone slipped from her hand and fell into the crevasse below. She immediately stopped, on the ladder, over the crevasse, and announced that they needed to stop because her phone was gone. She shone her headlamp down into the opening as though the phone might be visible somewhere in the dark. She debated out loud whether they could somehow retrieve it. Yael pointed out that it had a good camera on it and that they needed the footage. Nazir stood on the far side of the ladder and waited. They eventually moved on. The phone was gone. The climbers who passed them during this incident kept their opinions to themselves until they were safely out of earshot. They reached Camp Warren, which sits above the icefall at about 900 feet, in significantly worse shape than they should have been. That night, the cold went to work on what they didn't know. Proper storage of boot liners, the insulating inner layer that sits between your foot and the hard outer shell of a mountaineering boot, is one of the fundamentals of high-altitude camping. At night, you pull the liners out and sleep with them inside your sleeping bag, so body heat keeps them from freezing solid. If you leave them in the boots, they freeze, and in the morning, you are cramming your feet into frozen blocks of material. You cannot feel your feet, and feet you cannot feel at altitude are feet that are dying. None of them did this. Nobody had told them to, and apparently none of their online research had covered it. The next morning, one of the women, accounts suggest it was Saskia, reported that she couldn't feel several of her toes. The skin had started to go white and waxy, which is the first visible sign of frostbite. Real frostbite, not the light, reversible kind. The kind where tissue is beginning to die. Yael looked at it and told her it looked dramatic on camera. Nazir saw the white, waxy skin and his expression changed. He had seen frostbite before. Cargo porters sometimes got it on their hands. He knew it wasn't normal, but he later admitted that he knew they were too high to turn back easily, and he was overwhelmed by the responsibility. He told them it might be okay if they kept moving, hoping the descent would come soon. Camp 2 sits at roughly 21,300 feet, in the relatively flat section called the Western CWM, a wide glacial valley that funnels both climbers and wind with equal efficiency. By this point, they had been on the mountain for days without a single rest or acclimatization day. Their bodies were not adjusting because there was no time to adjust. Every morning, they pushed higher. Every morning, the oxygen thinned a little more. It was at Camp 2 that things nearly ended before they actually ended. An expedition leader from a commercial team, a man who had summited Everest 4 times and spent more than a decade leading guided ascents, noticed the 3 tents the women had set up. He noticed there were no permit tags, not on the tents, not on the oxygen bottles sitting outside. Every legal expedition has these. They're attached, visible, and checked. Their absence is not subtle. He walked over and asked politely who they were with and whether they could show their permits. The confrontation that followed was, by multiple witnesses' accounts, loud. Yael told him he was threatened by successful women. Saskia told him the permit system was corrupt and not everyone had the financial privilege to participate in institutional gatekeeping. May filmed it. The expedition leader kept his voice level and said he was simply asking to see documentation that every climber on this mountain was required to have. They packed up their camp and moved it in the dark to a location farther away, behind a ridge of ice where they were less visible from the main cluster of tents. This is the kind of decision you make when you are more worried about being caught than about being safe. Pitching camp in an unfamiliar section of a glacier at altitude in the dark is genuinely dangerous. But getting discovered was more dangerous to the project, so they moved. In the scramble to relocate, Nazir anchored one side of a tent platform incorrectly. The tent held, barely. But for the rest of that night, the women took turns physically holding the tent poles upright when wind gusts hit, because the anchor wasn't strong enough to keep the tent taut. They sat inside and held the poles, in the dark, at 21,000 feet. They also stopped doing radio check-ins around this time, which the expedition community had noticed. Legal teams do scheduled check-ins with base camp and with expedition operators. The check-ins are how people know you're alive. The women stopped doing theirs because they understood that communication logs were one of the ways officials tracked legal teams, and they couldn't afford to show up in any official record. By the time they reached Camp 3, which sits at around 23,600 feet on the Lhotse face, a nearly vertical wall of blue ice that climbers ascend using fixed ropes. The collective deterioration was obvious to anyone who saw them. May had been secretly taking Diamox, a medication sometimes used to help with altitude acclimatization symptoms. Diamox is a diuretic. It works by making you breathe faster, which increases the oxygen in your blood, but it also causes you to lose fluids rapidly. At altitude, where the dry air already dehydrates you faster than you realize, Diamox requires you to drink significantly more water to compensate. May was not doing this. She had taken the drug, felt briefly better, and interpreted that as license to keep going without paying attention to how much she was drinking. By Camp 3, she was severely dehydrated. Headache, dizziness, dark urine, the cognitive fog that comes when your blood thickens and your brain isn't getting what it needs. She didn't tell anyone this was happening. She filmed a short video from Camp 3 in which she talked about how incredible it felt to be above the clouds. Yael was vomiting again, not occasionally, regularly every few hours. She attributed it to the food. She had been vomiting periodically since the helicopter landing, and at no point had anyone connected the ongoing nausea to the fact that her body was giving a sustained, increasingly desperate signal that it was not okay. Saskia's toes were worse. Nobody mentioned it on camera anymore. The section above Camp 3, climbing toward the South Col, and then toward the balcony at around 27,600 feet, is where Everest sorts the prepared from the unprepared in a way that is final and unambiguous. Other climbers on the route, members of legal expeditions with experienced guides, proper equipment, acclimatization days, and functioning oxygen systems, began quietly passing the three women and Nazir, not because they were faster or fitter in some permanent sense, but because the women kept stopping for the wrong reasons and kept making mistakes that slowed everything down. Yael unclipped from the fixed rope multiple times so that drone footage would look unobstructed. The fixed rope on the upper mountain is not a suggestion. It is a physical connection between you and the mountain. That means if you slip, you stop falling after a few feet instead of continuing until you hit something hard enough to end you. She unclipped from it so her footage would look cleaner. Saskia kept forgetting to open her oxygen valve after rest stops. You stop, you sit down, you breathe, you rest, and when you stand up and start climbing again, you open the valve on your supplemental oxygen so that it flows. Saskia kept standing up and climbing without opening the valve. She would go several minutes at extreme altitude breathing nothing before she or someone else noticed the mask wasn't delivering anything. Each time this happened, it was a small additional insult to a brain that was already running on fumes. Nazir had handled oxygen bottles before. Cargo loads often included them. He knew how to read a pressure gauge. But at altitude, with 3 panicked clients, his ability to focus was fraying. He misread the gauges multiple times, confusing the working pressure with the remaining volume. It was the kind of mistake an exhausted, overwhelmed person makes, not a total novice. Experienced guides from other teams who passed them during this section said later that they considered reporting the group to officials. They discussed it. They were fairly certain these women were not legal, and they knew they were in serious trouble. Nobody made the call. Most of them assumed someone else would. Some of them thought the women were close enough to turning around that it might not matter. Some of them simply didn't want the complication. It's one of those things that's easy to understand in the moment and impossible to justify in retrospect. The women pushed through the night. There was no discussion about turning back. Yael had sold sponsored content tied to summit footage. The whole project was built on reaching the top and posting the video. Turning back meant losing sponsors. Turning back meant their followers would ask questions. Turning back meant the entire scheme. The fake expedition patches they had stolen from a dissolved climbing team and were wearing on their jackets to look legitimate. The bribe checkpoint workers, the deleted footage of them discussing fake identities, and their plan to avoid Nepalese climbing authorities would have been for nothing. So they climbed. And the mountain, which does not negotiate and does not care about follower counts or sponsorship deals or how much conviction you carry into its dead zones, was already deciding what came next. Near the balcony, in the dark, with temperatures somewhere around -40 degrees Fahrenheit and the wind picking up from the west, Nazir made the mistake that finished it. He was managing the remaining oxygen bottles, something he had done correctly on cargo loads, but never while hypoxic and sleep-deprived. He sorted them by feel, by weight, trusting his hands more than his fading vision. But at that altitude, his hands lied. He handed the women bottles that felt heavier, but were nearly empty, and kept one that felt lighter, but was full. He didn't know. The margin between life and death had shrunk to a misjudged weight. Yael lost consciousness first. She was clipped to the fixed rope when it happened, so she didn't fall. She just stopped moving, hanging against the line at 27,600 feet in the dark. May found her there. May stood next to her for a while, trying to rouse her, calling her name. Then May started talking about the sponsorships, about how they couldn't go back without the footage. She said this to Saskia, who was sitting in the snow nearby. She said she wasn't leaving Yoel because if they didn't have summit footage and something happened to Yael, it would look like they had abandoned her for views. Saskia, by this point, was not processing information normally. She was deep in the hypoxic fog that hits at extreme altitude when your oxygen is gone, and your brain is working on whatever residual supply remains in your bloodstream. The confusion comes first, then the hallucinations, then the certainty. which feels completely real and completely urgent, about things that are not happening. Saskia became certain that authorities were coming to arrest them. She said it out loud. She said it several times, with increasing panic. She unclipped from the fixed rope, to hide, presumably to get away from whoever was coming, and walked off the established route into the deep, untracked snow to the side of the path. She kept going. Nobody followed her. Nobody was able to. By morning, all three women were dead within a few hundred feet of each other on the upper mountain. Yael still hanging from the fixed line. Saskia somewhere in the snow to the side of the route. May collapsed near where she had last been standing. Nazir survived. He stumbled, nearly blind from snow exposure and hypoxia, into a camp belonging to a legal expedition lower on the mountain. They brought him down. He was frostbitten, confused, and alive. Nazir was arrested and faced charges related to illegal guiding and operating without a license. Nepalese authorities launched a wider investigation into the helicopter operator and the checkpoint workers who had been paid to look the other way. Several of the women's sponsors quietly removed any mention of the expedition from their websites and social media, though not before screenshots had circulated widely.